I'll go on with Dynamics of Faith, and you'll see some continuity between the poem and what's happening here. So first of all, again, I want to say that I remember reading Dynamics of Faith in college. I remember being super impressed by it, and I remember it fundamentally changed how I thought about religion. And as I'm reading it again, two things. I really didn't remember how dense it is. I've read the book several times, but never in preparation for teaching the book. So as I've tried to summarize it, I realize it's almost not summarizable. In fact, I read a few summaries online, and the summaries are more dense than the book itself. And my challenge is to make it understandable, because I think if you don't have a philosophic background in the huge philosophic questions of the 19th and early 20th century, especially what led to existentialism and other things, you actually don't know what questions he's answering. So let me talk about that just for a moment. So remember, Paul Tillich is born in 1886. He's a Lutheran. Already as a young person, he was involved in humanism, and he understood acutely the problem between, let's say, the humanistic urge, the critique of the New Testament that was already going on in the late 1800s or early 1900s, people trying to understand the historical background of the New Testament, beginning to slide away from the idea that the New Testament was the very Word of God. I should add here the Hebrew Bible as well. And therefore, if it's not the very Word of God and we can locate it historically, why should we revere it? What does it mean? Why does it draw us? So he's already struggling with these questions. And he served as a chaplain in the German army in the First World War. And the carnage that he saw utterly ruined any lingering, I'll say, traditional dogmatic Christian faith. However, he remained a committed Christian and was part of the movement in Germany away from traditional dogmatic Protestant Christianity into a more existentialist. So let me try to define that word. By the way, when I was in high school, I was already a committed existentialist. I had read Sartre and Camus and many others. And I remember once when I was on kibbutz, someone told me, we're afraid to talk about existentialism in front of you. I said, okay, I'm sorry, because I certainly could wax on about existentialism. So here's the core idea as I gained from reading Camus' literature, Sartre's thought, and then other summaries of existentialism. It goes something like this. Starting with Nietzsche, I'll say, there was an emphatic rejection of any philosophic or religious system. Nietzsche had very unkind things to say about religion in general and Christianity in particular. He had very unkind things to say about philosophers after the Greeks and after Kant. One of the most memorable lines in Nietzsche is that philosophers claim to be defending the truth. And Nietzsche said, if you're depending on these people to save the truth is in great trouble. He's known for saying God is dead. That's highly misinterpreted, because what he meant is religion is dead. And anybody who's committed to dogmatic religion is spiritually dead based on what we know. So the mood of existentialism is you can't trust any dogmatic system to get you to the truth. So Tillich, as an existentialist, has the question, well, what do we do with Christianity? I mean, do we abandon it? Do we leave it? I know that was one of my questions as I went through my military service time on the kibbutz, and I decided to major in religion. And luckily, this was the first book I read in college as a religion major. So the ideas of existentialism permeate the book. So for those looking to understand it, let me just say, I think, three brief things. First of all, he completely redefines what the word faith means. So one of the problems in dynamics of faith is that he distinguishes kind of arbitrarily, but it fits in his system, between faith and belief. Now, I say arbitrarily because faith is simply a Latin-based word, and belief is a German-based word. Fides means loyalty to, as we Marines say, semper fidelis, and belief is from the German beloved. Of course, belief came to mean, after Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and others. I'll say faith, belief. I'll focus on belief because this is how Tillich teaches it. Belief is holding something to be true without evidence. So, for example, my commitment to moral realism, that there really are better and worse answers to moral questions. So I'm not saying I know the answers, but I know that when we say something is moral, it's not just an opinion. We're saying something about the nature of the universe, about the human condition. I'll just extend to love, justice, truth, and beauty. These are not empty words. They are not opinions. There actually are better and worse ways to define these words. So Tillich said there are beliefs which are believing things are true. And, for example, my belief in moral realism without enough evidence. And he knows that this is an important idea, but he rails against it as the core of faith. So he redefines faith, and he redefines faith in a very existentialist and humanistic way. I mean the great humanism that came out of Germany in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then from the United States in the 50s and 60s. So what was his idea of faith? His idea of faith is to be ultimately concerned, and ultimate concern can only come from a centered human being. So he sets a pretty high standard. So if you don't contemplate the core of your being, if you don't line up thoughts, emotions, feelings, how you perceive the world, the symbol systems that you live in, from Tillich's perspective, and I think this is actually quite elitist because I really don't know anybody who lives that way. I certainly don't think about these things every day. But I know the humanist enough to know that as they talked about self-realization, self-actualization, it meant some kind of very deep knowledge, first of all, deep insight, and aligning yourself. And therefore, ultimate concern, which is his idea, what faith is focused on, is more or less anything that is not ultimate. Now, remember, he was chased out of Germany. He was the only non-Jew chased out of Germany in 1933, which he held as a badge of honor. So for him, it was nationalism, National Socialism, communism, where people believed something so much that they committed their lives to it. And the belief was so great that people could not actually admit that it was horrific, that the things they believed in led to horrific consequences. People do all kinds of mental gymnastics to justify National Socialism and communism. By the way, Martin Heidegger among them. Martin Heidegger turned on his Jewish teacher, Edmund Husserl, and he was a member of the Nazi Party. The only way you could stay a professor is to support Nazism. And I read his speech, when he was, I forget which academic role, and, it was just an exercise in moral obfuscation. I don't think the Nazis in the audience understood a word he was saying and just trusted him to support Nazism. And by the way, he never recanted. So Tillich and many of those others were people who profoundly opposed National Socialism. Of course, as Stalin, as the crimes of Stalin became known, they rejected communism. There were Protestant theologians that stayed in Germany and decided that their job was to lead the community of authentic Christians in Germany. For example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed by the SS in April 1945. So there's some incredible courage going on here. And when Tillich comes here, he realizes, it's hard for me to say this, but what does it mean that Germany is the birth of the Reformation, but meant nothing in the face of National Socialism? How deeply did people believe it that they could so quickly abandon it and seemingly support the crimes that went on in the 1930s and afterwards? So along with the humanists, he felt that people could believe horrific things because they actually didn't have a deep sense of self that connects us with ultimate concern. And it's a hard term to define, so I'm just going to put it in my language. Ultimate concern flows to us as, for example, love, justice, truth, and beauty. So if I attach myself to a God beyond God, and for me, it's a meditative, contemplative experience. So you might say, in my subjectivity, he talked about this a lot, there's an object. And my subjectivity and the object, meaning God, are in conversation with each other. And then the question is, how does that flow back into me? And he calls this theonomy, meaning living under the law of God, but he doesn't mean any religion. Nomos has the idea of a moral order, and a moral order that is rooted in the reality of the divine, the reality of ultimate concern. So in the first part of the book, and again, it's a hard book for anybody who doesn't have a philosophic background. He redefines what the word faith means. He reconstrues Christianity, by the way. I'll talk next week about the Protestant principle. When I read it, I said, there's more people that believe this than Protestants, but he calls it the Protestant principle. I'll talk about that next time. But for our concerns, let me just read a couple of things out and we can move forward. I'll mention a little bit about faith and doubt. So he says there's belief doubt, which is I can doubt my beliefs because I know there's not enough evidence. There's a kind of humility there. So how do people overcome it? Thomas Aquinas says you will yourself. It's an act of will to believe without evidence. So ultimate concern has nothing to do with evidence. Has nothing to do with it's called a volunteerism, meaning you voluntarily accept a belief system. He says the doubt with ultimate concern, he says, is fundamental to the integrated personality. The integrated personality, part of an integrated person, is some degree of doubt in oneself, doubt in one's thinking, doubt in how one understands things. So doubt is not what happens when you believe more than the evidence is. Doubt is actually part of the authentic human condition. So look how he takes the idea of doubt, which was addressed in many different ways in the history of Christianity, and he more or less redefines what the word doubt means in his focus on the authentic person. So what does this mean to everybody here? First of all, to read Tillich, and again, I'm not recommending anybody should, but I'm summarizing here, it requires a contemplative practice. If one does not have a contemplative practice where you try to find the core of your being, when you try to find the values that guide your transformation as a human being, you won't understand what Tillich means by faith, meaning the integrated personality, and in that subjectivity, reaching for the God beyond God, and then being able to accept that which returns from the divine. So as I read the book, there's definitely a mystical dimension. In fact, when I've been rereading his History of Christian Thought, and he sees mysticism as one of the three pillars of Christianity. And many people don't like the word mysticism. And he said, everybody who doesn't like the word mysticism don't understand it. because mystics have a direct experience of God. So there are the theologians who try to organize faith. There are those who are concerned with obeying the tenets of faith. And the mystic is looking for direct experience of God, which I think, as I read it, I thought to myself, well, that's where I am. Meaning, I don't have much dogma when it comes to Judaism. My question is, what is efficacious in creating religious experience? So if anybody says, well, how can you prove this and how can you prove that and what about this? I said, I'm really not interested in that. I was actually asking myself today, sorry, I'm going on, do I have a dogma? Yeah, here's one. The depth of Torah, the study of Torah, and the depth of the interpreters of Torah. I've been reading Aviva Zornberg all week. If a person says to me, oh, this is just a ridiculous book of superstitious stories and inaccurate history, I'll say, well, you haven't read the book. And you certainly haven't studied the book. So I'm pretty attached to that idea. But then I have to, go into myself and reach toward the divine. And I just have a deep sense that the authors of many of the texts that were combined into the Torah and the rest of the Bible were people touched by God. People who actually had this sense of faith, not just belief. So there are probably some quasi-dogmas, in residence here. But the main thing for you, and by the way, this connects beautifully with the idea of courage. Shanti's poem didn't mean, the courage as bravery. It meant something entirely different. Courage as a way of living, courage as a way of being, which Tillich focused on in the one book right before this, The Courage to Be. And part of the courage to be is the courage to exist without reliance on a dogmatic system. By the way, that was one of my great critiques of, as you know, of critical race theory, which is virtually a restatement of tenets of Marxism. I've studied Marxism carefully. I reread some of the books about Marxism, and I think it's almost a perfect example of a belief system that is not sustainable with an integrated personality reaching toward the divine. Now, there are parts I agree with, but as I read it, I thought to myself, this is very thin. It doesn't sustain a life of faith. So that's an example for me. When people say, what do you think about critical race theory? I say, look, I know there's been prejudice. I know the history. I know the history very well. But that doesn't mean I believe in a Marxist interpretation of history. I just don't. And I'll share with you something. There is a Marxist idea that police cause crime. Because of police oppression, there's crime. And if you take off police oppression, crime will go down. Hence, defund the police. And people made the argument to me, and I said, what do I know? Maybe it's right. Let's have some municipality defund the police, and if crime goes down, I will be the first to admit that I'm wrong. That hasn't happened, so I'm going back to the idea that the existence of police does not cause crime. Now, the cause of crime are many and varied, and we really don't understand it. But remember, in my ultimate concern, which comes down as love, justice, truth, and beauty, first of all, I have to love my fellow as myself. And if someone finds himself on the other side of the law, yeah, I can judge that. But the judgment has to be in the context of love. I'm after justice. And there are many things wrong with our system of justice. There are many untrue things that people, in my opinion, that people believe. And I think beauty has completely fallen out of our discourse. I'm going to throw a challenge out to you, and you can respond when I stop talking. Who is the most notable, the most respected and revered philosopher in America today? And who is the most notable, revered, and respected theologian in America today? I thought about it. I couldn't come up with a single name that's somewhat partisan. I mean, like respected on all fronts. If I don't agree with him, I still respect him. So if you're having trouble with dynamics of faith, he defines faith in a completely unusual way, very much rooted in existentialism, which at its core is the rejection of any dogmatic system that we think is going to save us from the confrontation of the human condition. So if we can't believe in a system, what's there? Well, the existentialists spend a lot of time talking about that. So that's one thing. It's a very existentialist book. And so beyond existentialism, it's humanistic, meaning he really takes seriously humanistic psychology and the idea of human inner integration and connecting human integration with a reality that is, he calls it the God beyond God. So for those of you who have been a little mystified by the dynamics of faith, don't worry, you don't have to read it. I'll read it and try to explain it. And tonight, my goal has been just to give you a couple of insights to tell you what I derived from it when I read it at 22 years old. And boy, was my understanding of religion shallow. You know, all I knew was kind of Jewish apologetics. And my teacher, I still remember her, Professor Ross Bryant, she asked a question in the beginning of class, and I just, I rose my hand and gave some shallow answer based on like defending Judaism. And she answered very patiently and very kindly. And then we started reading Dynamics of Faith, and I just wanted to hide my head for that. Whatever we were taught, in Hebrew school, it wasn't about this. No one ever touched this. And I remember thinking, I believe so deeply in existentialism, but I've never brought it to my religiosity. And here's the book. And that's one reason the book changed my approach. And by the way, this is deeply a part of the culture of our synagogue. We don't rely on a dogmatic foundation. We don't rely on some kind of halakhic standard that people have to do this or have to do that. We don't rely on any consensus about faith and belief. So we're interested in that, but it's not core to what we do. What's core to what we do is insight into the soul, into the inner life. I think that is core to our culture. Experience our values, which I believe emanate from the soul. Try to make our behavior accord with our values. And then reach beyond love, justice, truth, and beauty all the way to the good and the holy and the divine. I say if we're going to define our religious culture, that's how I would define it. And as I go on with a few more talks on Paul Tillich, you'll see how much the religious culture that I feel I'm in, which I realize I've taught my entire life, including the 30 years of Orator's existence.